They called it a marriage, though no church bell rang and no hymn dared to rise. In the pine-choked air of South Carolina, the whispers traveled faster than the river itself. An old man had taken his own blood as his bride. Some swore the earth soured when their vows were spoken. Others claimed they saw shadows at the windows of Black Cyprus, children with eyes too old for their faces. By the year 1839, the town had learned to look away, but the soil had not. It began as a rumor, carried first by a seamstress who had been called to stitch a gown of white for a girl she thought too young to marry. She whispered that the cloth resisted her hands, puckering where the needle pierced, as though the fabric itself recoiled. By dusk, the whispers had spread to the grocer, to the men by the river ferry, to the women who washed linens at the well. An old man of 70 winters was set to marry his granddaughter, a girl of 16 with hair the color of pale wheat and eyes that did not lift from the ground. The townsfolk tried to laugh it off, calling it superstition, calling it slander, but their laughter fell flat beneath the weight of the moss-hung oaks. By the time Sunday came, and the church should have prepared for a wedding, the bells hung silent, their ropes untouched. No guests gathered, no feast was laid. Yet in the distance, some swore they heard the faint ring of cutlery against china, the low drone of voices, repeating words not meant for mortal ears. At Black Cypress, the plantation house loomed against the horizon, its shutters closed, though the night was warm. A single lantern burned in the upper chamber, pulsing like a heartbeat through the trees. No one saw the ceremony, though a few claimed the priest walked in upright and came stumbling out at dawn, his collar torn, his mouth muttering prayers like broken teeth. The girl, now both bride and granddaughter, was glimpsed only once, leaning from the balcony in her gown of white, the fabric marked with a stain no one dared name. The old man stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his grip more like a claim than a comfort. And though the town told itself to forget, though they spoke of weather and crops and anything but that marriage, the silence between them deepened. The river fish died without cause, the peach blossoms browned before fruit could form, and every night, when the wind moved through the cypress trees, it carried a sound too faint to name, too dreadful to ignore, like the echo of a vow that had never been meant for human ears. The house at Black Cypress had always been a landmark, its chimneys rising above the swamp grass like a watchtower keeping secrets. Built before the Revolution, it carried the weight of generations in its bricks, each stone laid with hands both enslaved and forgotten. By 1839, the house seemed more alive than its occupants. The cypress trees leaned close to its windows as if they listened, their branches heavy with moss that swung like nooses in the humid wind. The air around it never stilled. Insects thrummed, frogs croaked, yet the sound seemed muted when one stepped onto its porch, as though the house itself consumed noise. Locals avoided the path that led there, though it was the fastest route to the river. Children dared each other to run past its gates at night, but none lingered. They said the shutters blinked and that the windows held reflections of people who were not there. Inside, the walls were paneled with dark wood, but the grain had warped into shapes that resembled faces. Some swore they saw mouths open in screams when the firelight hit just so. The house smelled faintly of damp earth and something sour, like milk left too long in the heat. No matter how often rugs were beaten or windows opened, the smell remained, clinging to the very bones of the place. The girl granddaughter turned bride, walked its halls with her head bowed, her pale hair catching the light of lanterns that seemed dimmer around her. She never spoke, though her footsteps were often heard pacing the upstairs chambers long past midnight. Servants whispered that they saw her standing in front of the nursery door, though no children had lived in that house for years. The grandfather kept his study locked, yet the sound of scratching drifted from it at night, like quills on paper or claws on wood. Visitors noted the grandfather's change most of all. His voice, once gravelly with age, grew steadier, almost youthful, though his body remained bent and lined. He smiled often now, a thin smile that never reached his eyes, and he called his new wife by two names, granddaughter and bride, never settling on one. The town gossips wondered aloud if the house had chosen him rather than the other way around. After the wedding, shutters that had long hung crooked closed tight without touch, doors latched themselves, and the bells that hung in the dining room chimed, though no hand drew them. The Black Cypress house seemed to pulse with a strange vitality, as if the marriage had given it new breath. By late summer, the orchard nearby bore fruit too early, the peaches swollen and red, but when bitten into, they bled a juice as dark as wine and smelled faintly of iron. Those who tasted them spat the flesh from their mouths, swearing never to return. Yet the old man ate them by the bowl, smiling through his stained teeth, as though the house, the land, and the marriage had finally given him what he had long sought. They called her a bride, yet in the same breath they called her child. She was 16 years old. Though her body carried itself with the hesitant grace of someone younger, her shoulders bent, as though already bearing a weight she did not understand. Some in town referred to her as the granddaughter, others as the wife, and in that confusion lay the first sign of the curse. For what is a name, if not the chain that binds us to the world? To have two names, spoken in equal measure, was to walk with one foot in shadow and one in light. The girl moved quietly through Black Cypress, her face rarely lifted. Her hair, pale as flax, caught the candle glow, and her eyes, gray with a faint, unnatural sheen, seldom met another's gaze. The servants whispered that when they spoke to her, she sometimes did not answer, because she could not tell which name belonged to her in that moment. Was she blood, or was she bride? Was she meant to sit at her grandfather's knee, or in his bed? The paradox consumed her until silence became her only refuge. On the night of the wedding, when the seamstress unpinned her gown, she discovered inside the hem a hidden stitch of red thread running the entire length, woven so tightly it seemed part of the fabric itself. The girl had not sewn it, nor had the seamstress, and yet it was there, like a signature from some unseen hand. When questioned, the bride only lowered her head, her lips parting but no sound escaping, as though she had already surrendered her voice to the vow. In town, women argued over how to speak of her. Some called her victim, others whispered temptress, as though she had drawn the old man into sin with a gaze too knowing. But the men did not speak at all, their silence heavier than their wives' gossip, for they knew deep down that something had been broken that could not be mended with scripture or law. The girl became two people at once, granddaughter in daylight, bride in darkness. When she walked past the parlor mirror, her reflection doubled, one image still in girlish innocence, the other cloaked in the white veil of a wife. The priest, who had stood at the ceremony, swore that when he had spoken her name, he heard an echo, as if another voice behind her repeated the word in a tongue older than his own. He left town within the week, muttering that he had bound not two souls but three. By the month's end, even the animals seemed unsettled around her. Dogs whined at her passing. Horses refused the bridle when she approached. Children whispered that she smelled like damp roses left too long in water, and that her shadow sometimes moved when she did not. In the quiet of the house, she would sometimes stand at the top of the stairs, lips trembling as if to call for help, but no one knew which name she would use, bride or child, blood or possession. And in that hesitation, the house grew hungrier still. He was known only as the patriarch, a man whose age had long passed the measure of 70, yet whose shadow still fell long across the land of Black Cypress. His back was bent, his skin furrowed like the bark of the trees that hemmed his property, but his eyes gleamed with a strange vitality that unsettled those who dared meet them. Once he had been a stern figure in the town, feared for his temper and respected for his wealth. He had buried a wife in his 40th year, laid sons in the ground after fever swept the low country, and yet he endured. By 1839, he stood alone at the head of a family tree whose branches had withered, save for one fragile offshoot, the girl he had made both granddaughter and bride. Townsfolk muttered that his hunger for bloodline was not natural, that he had sought counsel from things not named in the good book. He was seen walking the riverbanks at night, whispering to the black water, and more than one fisherman swore the reeds bent toward him, as if in reverence. His study was a locked room at Black Cypress, its door of heavy oak always barred, yet strange sounds drifted through low chanting, the scrape of quills that seemed to continue long after the candles should have burned to stubs. When questioned, he smiled with lips stretched too thin, saying only that a man must preserve his legacy at any cost. His voice, once gravelly with age, grew steady in those days after the marriage, as though the very act had stolen youth back into his throat. Some swore his walk grew firmer too, his cane tapping less often against the porch boards. There were whispers that he had promised something to the shadows in exchange for a bloodline unbroken. The servants, those who had not yet fled, spoke of seeing him by the nursery door, fingers tracing the wood as though waiting for something yet unborn. They said he called upon the girl by both names, granddaughter when the sun was high, wife when the lanterns burned low. To him, the words seemed interchangeable, but to those who heard, it was like listening to a man speak with two tongues. Neighbors passing by claimed that when he stood on the balcony, the air thickened, birds falling silent as if the trees themselves feared him. He had become more than an old man, less than human, a vessel for a hunger that no sermon could cure. The priest who had fled left behind a single line in his final note, that the patriarch had sealed a pact not with heaven, but with the marrow of his own blood. And in the stillness of the South Carolina night, when the wind passed through the cypress and the shutters clapped of their own accord, it was said the house whispered his name back to him, not in reverence, not in fear, but in recognition, for Black Cypress belonged to him, and he to it, bound by a marriage, the soil itself would remember. No one in town witnessed the ceremony, yet everyone swore they felt it. The night of the wedding was heavy with stormless thunder, the air thick as though heaven itself held its breath. The bells of the little church at the crossroads hung still, their ropes untouched, though a wedding should have summoned them. Instead, a hush spread through the cypress groves, a silence broken only by the faint clink of glass and the cadence of words carried across the swamp, words not belonging to Scripture. The grandfather had summoned only family to Black Cypress, though few enough remained alive to fill the parlor. Those who did attend never spoke again of what they saw, their lips sealed as if by oath or fear. The priest, young and earnest, entered the house with his collar white and his Bible clasped in steady hands. But by dawn he stumbled from the gates, eyes hollow, hair streaked with gray. He would not utter a single sermon after that night, leaving the ministry altogether before vanishing from the county. What occurred in the candlelit dining room remained a secret, though the servants who lingered in the shadows claimed the vows were repeated 3 times, once by the man, once by the girl, and once by a third voice no one could see. When the bride was led forth, her gown gleamed unnaturally in the lamplight, as though woven from threads that shifted with color too faint to name. At the hem of the dress, stains appeared, small at first, then darkening into a bloom that no washing could remove. Her face was pale and expressionless, her lips parted, but no sound leaving them, as if the vow had cost her voice. Behind her, the grandfather walked straighter than he had in years, his cane forgotten, his eyes bright with a vitality that unsettled all who looked. The candles burned low, yet none guttered, and the shadows on the walls twisted against their light, bending as though bowing to some unseen presence. The feast that followed was quiet, the clatter of cutlery faint, though the food lay untouched. Witnesses whispered later that the wine in their cups had tasted of rust, and that when the grandfather raised his glass, the liquid swirled as though alive. Outside, the swamp insects fell silent, and the cypress trees bent their heavy branches toward the house, their moss swaying, though no wind stirred. The marriage, some said, had not been blessed, but bound, sealed by words older than the town itself, older even than the church that refused to ring its bells. By morning, the bride stood at the balcony, her veil trailing like a shroud, her eyes gazing into the trees. Those who passed claimed she looked like both a child and a widow, as if the union had aged her in the span of a single night. The old man's hand rested firm on her shoulder, not in comfort, but in possession. From that hour on, no one dared to speak of them in daylight, But when the darkness came, the whole town felt the vows echo in their bones. The wedding gifts came late, though no guest had carried them through the gates. On the morning after the ceremony, the granddaughter bride awoke to find a quilt folded neatly at the foot of her bed, the fabric cool, despite the humid air, its weight pressing down as though it had absorbed the heaviness of the night. No seamstress in town claimed to have stitched it, yet it bore patterns too deliberate to be accidental, rows of red thread winding in strange designs across the pale cloth. At first glance, it resembled a simple family heirloom, a gift passed down in quiet tradition, but when she spread it over her lap, the symbols revealed themselves. Crooked crosses that bent away from their centers, spirals that seemed to draw the eye deeper and deeper until dizziness took hold, and lines that intersected in ways scripture did not teach. The girl traced one finger along the thread, and her skin prickled as though she had touched something living. That night, she wrapped the quilt around her shoulders for comfort, yet no warmth followed. Instead, she felt watched, as though eyes stitched into the cloth regarded her from every fold. The servants whispered that they had seen her rocking gently in the parlor chair, murmuring under her breath, while the red thread glimmered in the lantern light like fresh blood. When one dared to draw near, he swore the patterns shifted, a spiral lengthening, a crooked cross breaking apart into the shape of a hand. Word spread quickly, though none dared to confront the grandfather, who seemed to take pride in the strange covering. He told the bride to sleep beneath it each night, claiming it would protect the lineage she now carried. Yet the nights grew longer and stranger. Each dawn, when the quilt was folded back, her skin bore faint marks, thin red impressions running across her arms and neck in shapes that mirrored the thread. They faded by midday, but returned again after sleep, as though the quilt pressed its symbols deeper with each passing night. The girl, caught between granddaughter and wife, ceased to protest. She carried the quilt with her even in daylight, dragging it behind her down the stairs, its edges gathering dust yet never fraying. Townsfolk who caught sight of her through the window turned away, unsettled by the way the fabric seemed to move when her hands were still. They whispered that it was no gift but a binding, a net woven with intention older than the house itself. By the close of the week, the orchard trees had begun to lean, their branches crooked in shapes that echoed the thread. The wind stirred, and the leaves rattled in patterns that resembled the stitched designs. And so the people of the town began to murmur that the marriage was not the only vow made that night, that the land itself had been wrapped in the same red thread, bound and knotted, and that none who lived near Black Cypress would ever be free of it. It began with whispers of movement in the upper windows, a flicker of pale faces when the lamps in town were being snuffed for the night. Children swore they saw other children at Black Cypress, their silhouettes framed by the warped glass panes. Some said the figures pressed their hands against the window, their palms so thin the bones showed through, others that their eyes glowed faintly like foxfire in the swamp. No one could say whose children they were, for the granddaughter bride had not yet borne any, and the house had long been emptied of laughter. The servants who remained claimed they heard the pitter of feet on the wooden floor above them, the hurried scurry of little bodies running through the halls, yet when they opened the doors, the rooms lay still and empty, dust thick on the boards. The girl herself was found more than once at the nursery door, her hand on the knob, her lips moving soundlessly as though answering someone within. The cradle, unused for years, had been carried back into place, its rockers creaking gently though no wind stirred. At night, the house changed. Those who passed by on their way to the river swore they heard lullabies drifting from the upper floor, sung in a voice not quite human, too slow and too low, as though each word had been dragged through centuries before reaching the ear. The grandfather, now more vigorous with each passing day, ignored the murmurs. When asked about the children at his windows, he only smiled, thin and pleased, saying, "The family grows." His eyes glittered when he said it, and none dared ask more. One bold boy, testing his courage, crept close enough to the fence and threw a stone at the glass. He ran before it struck, but he swore he saw a small face lean into the impact, the stone passing through as though striking water. That night, the boy fell fevered, babbling of red thread wrapped tight around his arms and chest. His mother found faint lines across his skin, as though marked by stitches. She burned his clothes and forbade him to speak of it again. In town, the whispers deepened, for though no child had entered Black Cyprus, they were seen there nightly, pale hands parting the curtains, gray eyes glancing into the dark, mouths moving in silence, as if speaking words only the house could hear. The bride, thin and wan beneath her haunted veil, was glimpsed once at the window too, surrounded by the children who were not hers. She held the red thread quilt over her shoulders, and the little ones tugged at it, as though begging her to join them in some secret play. By morning, only shadows remained, yet the glass bore handprints that no scrubbing could erase. It was then the town knew the house was not merely haunted, but hungry, gathering children not from the living, but from the spaces between, reflections that lingered where no flesh had been. And still the granddaughter bride remained within, as though she too were becoming one of them. By autumn, the girl's body betrayed her silence. Her belly swelled beneath the thin muslin of her gowns, round and firm, as though carrying not only flesh, but some heavy secret. The town measured the months and found the numbers wanting, for the marriage was scarcely new, yet her frame suggested she carried far longer than weeks could allow. Some muttered she had been with child even before the vows, though others whispered darker things that the seed of her grandfather had quickened too swiftly, as though it hurried to be born. The girl herself spoke not a word. She drifted through the halls of Black Cyprus, her face pale, her lips pressed tight, as though afraid that opening her mouth would let something escape. She no longer looked at the mirrors, for when she passed them, her reflection showed two of her, one thin and bowed, the other round with child, their faces misaligned, the second image smiling faintly when the first did not. Servants watched her with uneasy eyes. They said she held her belly at night as though listening, her head tilted, her ear pressed close to her own flesh. Sometimes she laughed, a sound brittle and thin, followed by murmured replies no one else could hear. They began to avoid the upper floor, claiming the air grew colder, the closer one came to the bridal chamber. The grandfather, however, walked with renewed vigor, his cane forgotten entirely now. He boasted that the family line would not die, that the child would be born strong and carry his name. Yet he did not call it grandson or granddaughter. He simply called it heir, the word clipped and sharp, spoken as if it were both blessing and curse. Outside the plantation, women whispered warnings to one another, crossing themselves when the girl's name was spoken. A midwife, old and bent with years, refused to come when summoned, muttering that no hands of hers would deliver a child sired in such a way. Still, the girl grew heavy, and Black Cyprus grew restless with her. Windows rattled, though no wind stirred. Doors swelled and creaked on their hinges, as though the house braced itself. At night, the sound of the cradle rocking drifted down the stairwell, steady as a heartbeat, and some swore the faint cry of an infant echoed long before its birth. The girl walked slower now, her skin stretched thin and luminous over the swelling, her eyes ringed dark, her silence unbroken. She carried the red thread quilt over her shoulders like a shroud, its strange symbols pressing deeper against her skin. The orchard bent closer toward the house, their branches heavy with fruit that rotted before ripening, as if the land itself bore sympathy pains. And though no one dared say it aloud, they all knew that what she carried would not be a child as other children are, but something older, something the grandfather had bargained for in his whispered prayers to the black waters. The silence in the town deepened, for they feared that to name it would give it strength. The cradle returned before the child did. No one knew who had carried it from the attic, where it had rested for decades, its rockers warped, its paint worn thin by time. One morning, it simply stood in the nursery again, positioned in the center of the room as though awaiting its charge. The bride found it first, her pale hand trembling on the doorframe. She stared at it for so long that the servants whispered she was rooted there, unable to step away until the grandfather himself appeared. His eyes gleamed with something like triumph, and he told her to leave it be, that the family must always have a place ready for its future. That night, the house groaned as though settling into new weight, and the cradle began to move. At first the servants thought it was the wind, though the shutters were bolted fast. The cradle swayed with slow patience, a steady rhythm that filled the upstairs hall with its creak. By the second night, the sound carried through the floorboards, and those below swore they felt it in their chests, a pulse rocking them towards sleep. By the third, there were whispers of faint crying, a mewling thin as mist, though the child was not yet born. The granddaughter bride took to sitting beside the cradle, her belly rising high, her hands folded in her lap as she leaned forward, listening. Some claim she whispered lullabies in answer, though no one had taught her songs. Once, a maid entered and saw her stroking the air above the cradle, her fingers tracing empty space as though touching a face that was not there. When the maid gasped, the girl turned her head and smiled, but her lips moved out of time with her eyes, as though two expressions warred upon her face. After that, the maid fled and would not return. The grandfather seemed pleased by the disturbances. He lingered in the nursery door at dusk, his shadow stretching long across the rocking crib, nodding as though approving of something unseen. He told those who questioned it that blood remembers that the child of Black Cypress would not come alone, but would be guided by those who had gone before. Soon, neighbors reported seeing lights flicker in the nursery windows, pale globes like lanterns swaying back and forth in rhythm with the rocking. Children passing by claimed they heard laughter, high-pitched and sharp, the sound of many rather than one. Their parents hushed them, urging silence, but fear grew in the town. For a cradle that rocked itself was not a cradle for any ordinary infant. It was a summons, a preparation, a vessel awaiting something the land itself had been promised. Each night the sound grew louder, the creaking turning into a groan that echoed through the house like the breath of some sleeping beast. And though the child had yet to draw its first breath, everyone knew that Black Cypress had already rocked it into being. The birth came on a night when the air was too still, when even the frogs in the swamp held their throats silent, as though the earth itself waited. The granddaughter bride labored in her chamber, with no midwife present, for the old women of the county had refused to attend, muttering that some things were not meant to be delivered by human hands. Only the grandfather remained with her, his voice low and coaxing, his face lit by the glow of a dozen candles that seemed to burn without flame. Hours passed, though no sound of pain left the girl's lips, only a steady breathing, as if she obeyed some rhythm older than her body. When the child came forth, it did not cry. It lay pale and perfect upon the quilt, its eyes already open, gray and glistening, fixed upon the rafters as though it recognized something unseen above. Its chest rose not with breath, but with a slow ripple, like water stirred by stone. The girl stared at it with wide eyes, her hand reaching, then stopping short, as though some part of her recoiled. The grandfather lifted the child with hands that no longer trembled, his face radiant with an ecstasy so fierce it frightened those who saw him. He called the infant heir, not son, not daughter, as though its sex mattered less than the promise it fulfilled. Those who lingered outside the house that night swore they heard the walls groan, a sound like wood straining beneath sudden weight, and that the orchard trees bent closer still, their branches scratching the windows in a frenzy. By dawn, word spread that the child was alive but silent, that no breath had crossed its lips, though it blinked and moved as any other babe. The servants fled, leaving behind half-cooked meals and linens strewn upon the floor. One later claimed that when she glanced back at the nursery door, she saw not one cradle but two, one rocking gently though empty, the other holding the strange pale infant that watched her with knowing eyes. The bride herself wasted quickly after, her cheeks hollow, her voice lost entirely, though her gaze never left the crib. She sat by it each day, stroking the red thread quilt that covered the child, humming a tune no one could place. The grandfather grew stronger as she weakened, his back straight, his hair less gray, his voice commanding. He declared to the few who dared approach that the family was renewed, that the curse of death upon his line had been broken. Yet the townsfolk whispered otherwise, swearing that a birth without a cry was no birth at all, but an arrival, the beginning of something summoned rather than born. And at night, When the wind moved through the cypress, the sound that carried was no longer the rocking of one cradle, but many, a chorus of wood creaking in unison, as though the house prepared for children that had never drawn breath in the world of the living. The priest, who had once stood trembling at the altar of black cypress, did not remain in town long after the birth. His hair had gone white at the temples, though he was scarcely past 30, and his eyes darted like those of a hunted animal. He stopped attending the church, shuttered his small rectory, and was last seen carrying a satchel of papers across the swamp road at dusk. Weeks later, a farmhand stumbled upon that satchel lodged between the roots of a cypress tree. Within lay a single folded letter, its ink blurred by damp but still legible, a confession scrawled with a hand that shook. In it, the priest described the night he had performed the vows, how the words of marriage had seemed to split in his mouth, echoing back not once but thrice, as though some other voice repeated them in a tongue he did not know. He wrote that he had felt the floor tilt beneath his feet and seen shadows kneel when he commanded the couple to rise. He spoke of a presence that pressed upon him, cold and vast, and of a bargain that he knew he had unwittingly sealed. This union, he wrote, was not bound by God, but by marrow, by soil, by something that wears the mask of kinship. I fear it has made of me a witness and accomplice both. The final lines were scarcely legible, his script trailing into near scribbles. Yet one phrase could be read, a pact sealed with bone. After this discovery, no one saw him again. Some claimed he drowned himself in the swamp, pulled under by roots eager for flesh. Others whispered he had been taken into the house itself, his voice joining the lullabies that drifted from the nursery each night. The letter, passed hand to trembling hand among the townsfolk, deepened the unease that already hung heavy. Men spat into the dirt and swore it was devil's work. Women crossed themselves and hurried their children indoors before dusk, and yet none dared confront the grandfather or his pale bride. The church, without its priest, fell into disuse, its bell rusting silent, its pews gathering dust. The absence of worship spread like rot, for, without the voice of faith, suspicion grew into certainty. Black Cypress was no longer a home, but a sanctuary of something unnatural, held aloft by vows not meant for mortal tongues. The letter itself was eventually burned by trembling hands, yet the words clung to those who had read them, repeating in their dreams. They woke with a taste of iron in their mouths, their teeth aching as though something had pressed down upon their jaws. And when they gathered at dawn to speak of it, they found their words faltered, their throats raw, as if the pact had taken root in them simply by being known. The priest's confession had not freed them, it had bound them, just as surely as it had bound the girl, the grandfather, and the silent child beneath the roof of Black Cypress. The first stains appeared on the morning after the birth, small dark patches across the bridal chamber floorboards. At first, the servants believed it was wine spilled during the long night, but when they stooped to scrub, the smell rose sharp and unmistakable. It was blood, fresh and bright, though no wound could be found upon the girl or the child. Each dawn brought more of it, thin streaks across the quilt, droplets beading on the windowsill, as if the house itself had begun to bleed. The granddaughter bride sat wordless on her chair, her skin pale as milk, her eyes rimmed in shadow, while the grandfather walked the length of the chamber with a satisfaction that turned the stomach of those who saw him. He instructed the stains to be left untouched, declaring them signs of blessing, proof that the family's covenant was alive. Yet the servants could not ignore the way the blood clung, even after it was wiped away. It seeped back through the grain of the wood by dusk, a damp reminder that nothing remained clean within those walls. One maid swore she awoke to find crimson handprints across her apron, though she had not entered the chamber in days. Another, sweeping the hall, found droplets on the banister, spelling shapes too deliberate to be accident, curling loops like letters in a language unlearned. The child lay silent in the cradle, never crying, never cooing, its gray eyes wide and steady. Sometimes, when the stains grew thickest, its small lips curved as if smiling, though no sound escaped. The girl, frail and hollow, kept her gaze fixed upon it, her fingers tightening on the red thread quilt, as though afraid it might slip from her grasp. The blood did not limit itself to the chamber. Spots appeared on the steps, in the parlor, and once, even on the ceiling, where no human hand could have reached. Neighbors passing the house claimed to smell iron on the air, metallic and sour, carried on the breeze. They whispered that Black Cyprus itself was bleeding, that the earth had taken offense at the marriage, and now sought to warn those who lingered too close. Yet the grandfather grew stronger still. His step was quick, his voice steady, his eyes bright with a hunger no food could satisfy. He spoke of legacy, of lineage renewed, his lips flecked with red, as though he had drunk of the very stains themselves. By winter, the blood became routine, no longer startling but expected, as much a part of the house as its bricks and beams. Those who dared speak of it swore it was not blood alone but memory, seeping from the walls, like the stories of all who had lived and died there. And though the stains could be scrubbed and wiped and burned, each morning they returned, glistening in the dim light, as though Black Cyprus wished never to let the world forget the bargain that had been struck within its rooms. They arrived without warning, strangers who bore the look of kin, though no one in town could name their lineage. At first a pair, then three, then more. They came walking the swamp road toward Black Cyprus, their clothes heavy with travel, yet curiously unstained by mud. They carried no luggage, no coin purses, only small parcels wrapped in cloth, and when questioned by ferrymen or traders, they answered with the same flat phrase, "We belong to the house." Their faces bore an uncanny resemblance to the grandfather, the same sharp jaw, the same gray-flecked eyes, as though carved from his likeness. Some looked young, some old, but all carried the same stillness that made the air tighten around them. One evening, the town saw them gather at the gates, and by morning they were gone within the house, not a soul having watched them enter. From that night forward, lights flickered in the upper chambers, where no lamps had burned for years. Voices echoed down the stairwell, low and humming, like the murmur of a congregation. The servants who remained refused to ascend beyond the first floor, swearing that they passed faces on the stair that did not belong to any they knew. One claimed she felt a hand brush her sleeve, cold and damp, though no one stood beside her. The bride, pale and silent, seemed to know them all. She greeted each with a nod, her lips curving faintly, and sat with them in the parlor, while the child lay in its cradle. Sometimes she leaned her head against their shoulders, as though among them she no longer felt the weight of her silence. The grandfather was radiant with satisfaction, his chest broad, his back straight, declaring to the empty night that the family was not dying but growing. Yet the town grew uneasy, for no one ever saw the strangers leave. They walked in, but they did not walk out. Their voices drifted through the windows at night, reciting words in cadence too steady to be prayer, too dark to be song. Passers-by swore they saw their faces crowding the glass, eyes unblinking, mouths shaping words that fogged the panes. In time, the orchard itself began to thicken, the peach trees doubling in number, sprouting where no sapling had been planted. Their fruit hung swollen and dark, the skin splitting to reveal not flesh but pale seeds shaped disturbingly like teeth. The strangers were never accounted for again, their names unrecorded, their presence absorbed into the walls of Black Cyprus. Yet the house had grown louder, fuller, as though it had inhaled them whole, and now exhaled their voices. In the village, families barred their doors, mothers clutching children tight, for the fear was no longer of what dwelled within the house, but of what it might one day send out. And still the grandfather smiled, claiming his kin had returned. Though no grave had ever been disturbed, no journey explained, it was as if the pact itself had summoned them home, blood called back to blood, until the house was brimming with a family that had not existed the day before. The child grew, though not as other children do. By her second year she had learned no words of her own, yet she filled the house with sound. At first it was humming, a low and constant vibration that seemed to settle in the walls, the same note repeating until the servants pressed their hands to their ears. Soon she began to sing, but the songs that left her mouth did not belong to any hymnal or nursery rhyme. They poured out backward, syllables twisted and reversed, as though time itself had been unraveled in her throat. Those who heard her swore their tongues tingled, their stomachs lurched, and some wept without knowing why. The granddaughter bride sat always beside her, thin and hollow-eyed, nodding in rhythm as if she understood. Once, a visitor from town claimed to hear the girl singing alone in the parlor. He bent close to the window to listen, but when her voice reached his ear, he found his own name spilling backward from her lips, syllable by syllable, until it no longer sounded human. He stumbled away, sickened, his reflection staring back at him from every pane of glass he passed, lips moving though his mouth was shut. Inside, the grandfather listened with fierce pride. He called her a gift, his heir and legacy, proof that the bloodline had not ended but had evolved. He encouraged her, urging her to sing louder, longer, until her small voice filled every chamber of Black Cypress. At night, her songs drifted across the swamp, thin notes winding between the trees, waking birds that beat their wings against the dark. Families stirred in their beds, children crying out, covering their ears though the sound did not cease. The orchard trees bent lower, their fruit rotting before ripening, the smell of sour flesh thick in the air. Strangers who had come to the house now stood clustered around the child, their faces rapt, their bodies swaying as though to some ancient hymn. They whispered along with her, but their words carried no meaning, only fragments of sound that made the air heavy and wet. One servant who dared to remain described a night when the girl stood at the nursery window, her small hands pressed against the glass, singing into the dark. Her voice was joined by dozens of others, children's tones rising from nowhere, echoing hers in perfect backward harmony. The servant fled before dawn, but even as she crossed the swamp road, the song followed, clinging to her ears. When she reached the village, she found her own child sitting upright in bed, humming the same broken tune, though he had never heard it before. From that night on, parents forbade their children from straying near Black Cypress, but it was no use. The girl's voice slipped through shutters and doors, through cracks in walls, until it became a song the land itself seemed to know. And though her words meant nothing, the rhythm felt like a summons, as if each note pulled the living and the dead one step closer to the house that had claimed her. It began with footsteps at dawn, the quiet shuffle of bare feet across the dirt paths that led away from Black Cypress. One by one, the enslaved families who had lived and labored there for generations slipped into the swamp, carrying only what their arms could hold. They left iron pots still warm on the hearth, laundry still hanging damp upon the line, tools abandoned mid-row in the field. The girl's songs had filled the house so completely that none could sleep, her backward hymns pressing into their skulls until even their dreams were not their own. Some swore they saw children moving in the halls who were not flesh but shadow, pale faces peering through the dark. Others spoke of handprints left upon their arms that burned long after they were gone, as though the very walls had reached for them. The grandfather called after them, demanding they return, his voice carrying down the fields, but no one obeyed. They walked into the swamp in silence, their figures swallowed by the hanging moss, their tracks filling with black water before the hour had passed. By evening the house was emptied of its keepers, its kitchens gone cold, its fires reduced to ash. The granddaughter bride wandered the rooms like a ghost, her quilt dragging behind her, whispering to her silent child who never cried. In the town, word spread quickly of the exodus, and mothers clutched their children tighter when they heard the news. It was said the fleeing families would not speak of what they had seen, only crossing themselves and vowing never to look back. A few carried with them small bundles of hair and bone, tokens they claimed must be buried far from the plantation, for Black Cypress had begun to hunger for more than labor. At night, the windows glowed with pale light, though no lamps were lit, and neighbors swore they heard voices calling out across the fields, begging the departed to return. Some thought they heard their own names spoken, drawn into the backward song of the child who never slept. The grandfather raged in solitude, pacing the halls with his cane, striking the floorboards that now oozed faint streaks of red. Yet his fury was hollow, for his strength only grew. His cheeks regained color, his hands grew steady, his back unbent. He thrived while the house hollowed, the land twisting beneath him like clay. The town feared what it meant, For if Black Cyprus could drive away those bound to it by chains and blood, then it had claimed dominion greater than law. And though the fields lay untended, the orchard bore fruit without care, dark globes splitting open on the branch to reveal pale pits shaped like tiny hands. The swamp itself seemed to pulse with life, and those who lingered near swore the water bubbled, though no wind stirred. Black Cyprus no longer needed servants. It had claimed its own congregation, invisible but present, filling the halls with whispers, with footsteps, with songs that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. The granddaughter bride avoided mirrors after the birth, though they hung in nearly every chamber of Black Cyprus, relics of wealth and pride from generations past. For weeks she walked the halls with her head bent, clutching the red thread quilt around her shoulders. But one night she strayed too close to the long looking glass in the parlor. What she saw made her stagger back. The reflection staring from the silvered glass was not her own, or rather, not the girl she knew herself to be. Instead, an old woman stood there, her hair white as frost, her shoulders stooped, her eyes clouded with sorrow. Yet beside her in that reflection stood the grandfather, tall and straight, younger than the man she had married, his face firm, his smile wide, his hand pressed to her shoulder with proprietary weight. The girl turned, but no one was there. When she looked back into the mirror, the scene remained, her own body flickering like a candle flame, half her face young, half ancient, as though she lived two lives at once. She cried out, but her voice was only an echo swallowed by the parlor walls. From then on, she covered the mirrors with sheets, though each morning the coverings were gone, neatly folded at her feet. Servants who had not yet fled whispered that they too glimpsed strange things in the glass. One swore she saw her own face staring back, only eyeless, a hollow gaze that seemed to follow her even after she turned away. Another claimed she saw children crowded behind her, their mouths moving in silence, their lips leaving no mark upon the mirror, though fog bloomed with each breath. The girl refused to look again, but the reflections hunted her. She passed the hall mirror once and saw herself cradling two children, though her arms were empty. Another night, she glimpsed her reflection, smiling, though her lips did not move. The grandfather, however, reveled in it. He lingered before the glass, preening like a young man, straightening his coat, smoothing hair that no longer bore the pallor of age. He would call her to stand beside him, forcing her to confront the image of herself, grown withered, while he shone renewed. "Do you see?" he would whisper. "The house keeps its promises." His voice carried a resonance now, a timbre too strong for his years, as though the reflection itself fed him. The child, silent in its cradle, began to stir when brought near the mirrors, its gray eyes fixed on its own likeness. And once, when the bride dared to look, she saw not one infant but many reflected there, a row of pale children stretching into the distance, each identical, each waiting. The mirrors of Black Cyprus had ceased to reflect the world as it was. They showed instead what the bargain demanded: youth traded for age, lineage for freedom, faces that were not faces but echoes of what had been promised in blood. And the bride, trapped between child and wife, began to understand that her image was no longer hers to keep. By spring, the town found itself unable to recall what it once knew of the family at Black Cyprus. Pages in the church ledgers had loosened, their ink smeared until the names written there dissolved into blankness. Marriage records, once sharp and clear, bore gaps where lines had been, as though some hand had pressed too hard with an eraser. Even the courthouse archives, kept beneath lock and key, showed signs of tampering. The birth registry for the year of the granddaughter bride's arrival contained a space of silence, a blank between names, as though she had never been born at all. The clerks swore they had written her into their books, yet when they turned the pages there was nothing. Worse still, those who tried to speak of her found their tongues faltering. Conversation stumbled, words slipped away, and when they pressed to remember the details of her face, her hair, her very presence, they discovered their memory had dulled, edges blurred. It was as if the girl herself was fading from the world beyond the plantation, reduced to rumor alone, Some swore it was the work of the grandfather, that he had bribed or threatened the record keepers, but the fear in their eyes told another story. They looked at the empty spaces as if they were wounds, unnatural erasures no coin could buy. The priest's abandoned note passed hand to hand in whispers, and its warning that a pact had been sealed with bone echoed louder with each blank page discovered. The town grew quieter in its gossip, for to speak of what could no longer be written seemed dangerous, like summoning something best left sleeping. A schoolteacher who had once taught the girl remembered her sitting in the front pew, drawing patterns in her slate with chalk. Yet when he searched the classroom register, her name was gone, the space where it should have been stripped bare. He brought the slate he had kept as a relic, hoping it might prove her existence. But the surface bore only faint scratches, red spirals barely visible, nothing of letters or numbers. He left it on the church steps and never returned. One by one, the artifacts of her life vanished. Quilts sewn by her grandmother unraveled overnight. Portraits yellowed into obscurity. Even the grave markers of kin grew so moss-covered their names could not be made out. It was as though the family had been swallowed whole by the land, consumed not just in body but in record. And yet, within the house, her presence grew sharper, her figure clearer in mirrors, her child's songs louder in the halls. What disappeared from the world outside seemed only to root itself deeper within Black Cyprus. The erasure was not an accident but an exchange, memory traded for permanence, the cost of binding blood to blood in a vow that no book could hold. The town, robbed of its proof, ceased to speak of her altogether, and the silence around her name became another form of worship, a reverence shaped by fear. It was the dogs that found them first. Lean, restless hounds that had once prowled the fields returned from the orchard with jaws wet and eyes wild, dropping fragments at the feet of their masters. What they carried were bones, small and fragile, too delicate to belong to deer or hog. When the pieces were gathered, it became clear they were human. The curved arm of a child, the tiny ribs of something that had never grown tall. At first, the townsfolk whispered it must be old, relics from the wars or the pestilence years. But when more were unearthed, their whiteness betrayed their freshness. Each storm seemed to loosen the soil beneath the peach trees, and after each rain, the earth yielded more. Entire skeletons began to surface, curled as though they had been laid to rest quickly and without ceremony. Some still bore tatters of cloth, clinging to the bone, scraps of muslin and lace that fluttered like flags in the breeze. Mothers crossed themselves at the sight, clutching their children close, for the bones were too small to be mistaken for anything but the remains of the young. Rumor spread that these were the missing children glimpsed in the windows of Black Cyprus, their laughter echoing in the night. Some swore that when the moon was full, they saw pale hands pushing up through the soil, fingernails caked with earth as if they still sought to climb free. The orchard, once a place of sweetness and harvest, became shunned ground. Its fruit split open on the branch, dark pits spilling onto the dirt like offerings. The grandfather did not deny the discovery. When confronted, he only smiled with his sharpened vigor and said, "All families must root themselves in the earth. Ours has simply returned to it more fully than others." His words chilled even those hardened by years of toil, for they rang less like explanation than proclamation. The bride, frail and silent, was seen walking among the trees at dusk, her quilt dragging behind her, her pale hand brushing the soil as though caressing those who lay beneath. Some swore they heard her humming to the earth, and that the ground itself seemed to stir beneath her song. Dogs refused to enter the orchard again, whining and straining against their leashes when dragged too close. The town kept its distance, yet the bones did not stop rising. Each season revealed more, until the orchard floor was littered with fragments that no rain or plow could bury again, and the people whispered that these were not only the children of Black Cyprus, but all the little ones claimed by the pact, pulled from memory into soil, gathered so that the lineage of the grandfather might thrive. What had once been a place of fruit was now a graveyard without stones, the air thick with the smell of rot and iron. And though the townsfolk turned their faces away, they could not ignore the truth. The orchard itself had become a harvest of bones, and Black Cyprus fed on nothing less. She was the last neighbor willing to approach the gates of Black Cyprus, a widow older than the grandfather himself, her back bent, but her gaze unflinching. She lived alone at the edge of the swamp, her cabin ringed with jars of salt and bundles of herbs that kept sickness from her door. The townsfolk called her peculiar, whispered that she had seen too much of death to fear it anymore. One evening, she walked the path toward the plantation, her cane striking the earth in steady rhythm until she stood before the fence that sagged beneath the weight of moss. She did not cross it, but she raised her voice and called to the girl within. Those who overheard claimed her words carried like thunder, though her body was frail. She warned that the family had broken the oldest law, that blood must never fold back upon itself, and that such unions fed not God but hunger. Her voice quavered when she spoke of the orchard, of the bones the dogs dragged free, of the children who sang at windows though no flesh clothed their forms. She declared that the earth would not bear such trespass forever, that the swamp would claim what man refused to set right. The bride appeared at an upper window, her face pale, her eyes hollow. For a moment, she lifted a hand as if to reach toward the widow's call, but then the grandfather stepped behind her, placing his hand firmly upon her shoulder. He smiled down with teeth too white for his years and told the widow to tend her own business. Yet the old woman did not falter. She raised her cane and struck the ground, and those who watched swore the soil, shivered as though listening. She warned that the pact sealed in that house would spread like rot, leaching into every family who lingered near, and that the only cure was fire. With that, she turned and left, her steps slow but certain. In the nights that followed, townsfolk reported seeing her cabin lit with strange flames, blue and green, as though she worked some warding no man could name. She nailed symbols above her door and scattered chalk marks along her porch, warning all who passed that they must not let Black Cyprus swallow them whole. But her warning came too late for many. Children in the town began to wake, speaking in tongues they did not know, their chalk slates filled with spirals and crooked crosses drawn in red dust. Women found their wombs heavy, though no man had touched them, and men felt their bones ache as though pressed by unseen hands. The widow shook her head and told them the price was already spreading, that the blood of Black Cyprus sought company. She declared before all that unless the house was undone, the curse would bind itself to the soil until no family in the county was spared. And though fear silenced most, some began to whisper that perhaps the widow was right, that the land could only be cleansed by flame. It began on a night when the moon was hidden, when the swamp lay still and the air pressed heavy against the chest. No one could later agree on who lit the first torch, only that a small crowd gathered at the edge of Black Cyprus, their faces drawn and pale, their silence deeper than prayer. The widow's warning had taken root, and though none dared name themselves leader, they moved as one. Men carried oil, women clutched kindling, and children were told to stay behind, though some followed at a distance, unable to resist the pull of what was to come. The orchard stood black and twisted, its fruit bursting upon the ground with the stench of iron. The townsfolk crossed through it quickly, their boots crushing rotting flesh, their eyes averted from the bones that glimmered white in the soil. They reached the house, and it loomed above them like a watchful sentinel, its shutters tight, its windows aglow with a strange, pulsing light. The granddaughter bride appeared at an upstairs window, her face pale and unreadable, the quilt of red thread draped around her shoulders. Behind her, shadows crowded, shapes that did not belong to living flesh. The townsfolk raised their torches. Some claimed the house groaned at that moment, as though aware of their intent. The grandfather stepped onto the balcony, his face vibrant with youth, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He raised his hand and spoke, though the words did not carry, swallowed by the thick air. His mouth moved in a rhythm the watchers recognized from the child's backward songs, a cadence that chilled their blood. Someone hurled the first flame. It struck the porch rail and flared, then spread, leaping like a hungry beast. Oil followed, and soon the boards roared with fire. Smoke rose thick and acrid, carrying with it the scent of pitch and something sour, something not of wood or resin. The flames climbed quickly, licking the shutters, devouring the roof beams. Yet as the house burned, it did not wail as wood should. Instead, voices poured from it, dozens, hundreds, singing in reverse, a chorus of children crying out not in pain but in some dark exultation. The granddaughter bride remained at the window, unmoving, the quilt shimmering with its impossible symbols. The grandfather stood behind her, unflinching, his face illuminated in red light, smiling as though fire was the very fulfillment of his pact. Some swore they saw shapes dancing in the smoke, small figures holding hands, their bodies limned in flame but never consumed. The townsfolk dropped their torches and fled, stumbling into the swamp, their ears ringing with that dreadful chorus. By dawn, nothing stood but blackened stone and smoldering ash, yet no bodies were found among the ruins. The house had devoured its own as readily as it had devoured the land. Black Cypress was gone, but its absence left no peace, only a silence heavier than the one before, a silence that promised the fire had not ended the story, but merely fed it. Years passed, and the ruins of Black Cypress lay smothered beneath ivy and ash, its scorched stones jutting from the earth like the bones of some fallen beast. The townsfolk avoided the place, refusing even to cut timber from its fields, for the soil grew black and soft, swallowing tools whole. They told themselves the fire had ended it, that the curse was sealed beneath cinders. But on certain nights, when the wind carried from the swamp, the faint echo of children's songs still drifted through the air, sung in that broken backward tongue. It was on such a night that a wagon rolled into town, its wheels creaking beneath the weight of a solitary figure seated within. Witnesses swore it was the granddaughter bride, though she looked no older than on her wedding day. Her hair hung long and pale around her shoulders, and her face was thin, untouched by time. Draped over her body was the quilt of red thread, its strange symbols gleaming as if newly stitched. She walked the streets in silence, her bare feet leaving no mark in the dust, her eyes fixed ahead. Some who met her gaze claimed to see their own reflections staring back at them, but aged, hollowed, as if the glass of her eyes held futures they could not escape. She did not linger in town, but moved slowly toward the path that led once more to Black Cypress. When she reached the ruins, flames flared briefly along the charred beams, though no torch touched them, and the air filled with the thick odor of iron and rot. The people watched from a distance, frozen by fear, as she stepped into the skeletal remains of the house. For a moment she was lost in the darkness, and then the light of the quilt pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the ash. From the shadows of the orchard, children's laughter rose, not soft but sharp, a chorus swelling until it seemed the very trees bent to listen. The widow who had once warned the town stood at her cabin door that night and shook her head, whispering that the fire had burned wood, but not the vow, that pacts made with blood cannot be undone by flame. When dawn came, the ruins appeared untouched, no footprint in the soot, no sign of the girl, save for the faint impression of a body upon the ground where the quilt had lain. Yet, as the townsfolk crept closer, they found the trees leaning toward the house again, their roots cracking the soil as though the land itself welcomed her return. From then on, travelers swore they saw a woman in white walking the swamp road at dusk, her veil trailing like mist, her face ageless. She was no longer bride or child, but something between, a figure bound to the ashes of a house that had refused to die. The people whispered she was waiting, not for her grandfather, not for her child, but for the world itself to remember the vow it had tried so hard to erase. The years after the fire should have brought relief, yet instead they birthed new unease. Families across the county began to notice strange changes in their children. Infants born healthy and pink grew quiet too soon, their eyes opening wide before their lungs filled with breath. They watched with unnatural stillness, their gray pupils reflecting candlelight like mirrors. Some toddlers began to hum to themselves in the cradle, their songs lilting backward as if their tongues had been wound wrong in the womb. Mothers wept, clutching their babes, but when they sought help from midwives or doctors, no cure could be found. Others spoke of children who wandered into the orchard ruins at dusk and returned with soil under their nails and bruises shaped like thread around their wrists. No one dared admit it aloud, but the truth gnawed at them all. Black cypress had not died in the flames. It had scattered itself into bloodlines, planting seeds where least expected. One farmer whispered that his son spoke the name of the grandfather in sleep, a name never taught, rolling from his lips in a voice too deep for a child. Another swore his daughter drew spirals on the wall in red chalk until her fingers bled, smiling faintly when scolded, her gaze drifting toward the ruins as though called. The widow, older now and frailer, shook her head when confronted. She told the frightened mothers that fire cannot end what is bound in blood, that the land itself carried the pact forward. "It is not the house you must fear," she said, "but the soil beneath your feet, for it remembers what has been fed to it." Her words spread dread like a plague. Families who could fled the county altogether, abandoning homes and crops, unwilling to see what their children might become. Those who remained locked their doors at night, but still they heard laughter drifting through the fields, high voices singing in unison, too many for the number of children in their households. The quilt was said to appear again, glimpsed through windows or left folded upon doorsteps. Always it was gone by dawn, but those who touched it bore red welts that lingered for days. Fear took deeper root when the records of birth began to vanish once more. Newborns went unlisted, their names blotted out before they were inked, as though the pact was erasing history as quickly as it had once erased the granddaughter bride. And yet, no matter how the families tried to hide, the signs of inheritance multiplied. By the end of the decade, it was whispered that nearly every third child in the county bore some mark of black cypress eyes too pale, a voice too strange, or shadows that lingered too long at their heels. The people knew then that the fire had not cleansed but spread, scattering the lineage like seeds upon tilled earth, until the curse no longer belonged to one family, but to all who lived in the shadow of the cypress trees. The land kept its own memory long after the people tried to forget. Where black cypress once stood, ivy grew thick across the stone, but beneath it the soil remained dark, damp, and restless, as though the fire had only stirred something older awake. Travelers who passed along the swamp road said the ground there pulsed faintly at night, as if it still breathed, and those brave enough to press their ear to the earth swore they heard voices beneath whispers like lullabies, sung in reverse, layered with the sighs of children who had never reached their first word. Farmers in distant counties told of fields that yielded strange fruit, peaches that bled when bitten, corn that grew in crooked spirals, stalks bending in prayer to something unseen. When traced back, all these lands had once been fed by the waters that ran past the ruins of Black Cyprus. It was as though the bargain, sealed in blood and bone, had spilled beyond its boundaries, soaking into the veins of the earth itself. Families that remained in the region carried its proof in their children. A boy born in the village lifted his eyes moments after birth, gray and unblinking, fixing his mother with a gaze that made her cry out in fear. A girl in the next parish sang to herself at the age of 3, though the song she sang had no words the living could understand. By the time she was 5, the mirrors in her house no longer reflected her alone, but showed 2 of her, one smiling when she did not. The old widow who had warned them lived to see it spread, her body bent and her voice cracked, but her words as fierce as ever. She told them the truth. They wished not to hear that Black Cyprus was never just a house, never just a family. It was the soil itself, a covenant buried so deep that fire could not burn it away. She said the land would go on, birthing children not wholly their own, heirs to a vow struck long before they were conceived. Her warning was ignored by some, for fear had hardened into silence, but her words carried weight enough to linger. Generations later, when strangers came seeking records, they found only gaps, names erased, births forgotten, lines broken where there should have been continuity. Yet the faces of the people bore proof, the same gray eyes glinting in the dusk, the same thin mouths humming songs no mother had taught. They did not speak of Black Cyprus anymore, but they carried it in their marrow, in every step across the land that remembered. And when the wind rose through the swamp at night, bending the cypress trees like mourners bowing in grief, those who listened closely swore they could still hear vows spoken in the dark, echoing through soil and stone, promising that the line would never end, and that silence itself was the truest witness to the marriage that should never have been. And so the land remembers what people choose to forget. Black Cypress may be ash and ruin, but its vow still hums in blood, bone, and soil. Tell me what curses linger in the oldest places where you live. Comment the oldest town in your country. And if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to the Black Chapter.